will start now the second session of our conference, which will be dedicated to the relationship between the birth of sociology and the cooperation movement and the relations between them. As an introduction, I want to read you some words of Polish cooperative thinker and an activist from the beginning of the 20th century, Edward Milewski. He described cooperation as an applied sociology. It will be also a title of our volume, which we are preparing with Aleksandra Bilewicz in next year, but also only in Polish, unfortunately. But back to the Milewski. He said that cooperation is a applied sociology, that social investigations are a basis to create cooperative institutions. I have a feeling that this thesis is strictly connected with the topic of our session. The simultaneous birth of cooperativism and sociology in the 19th century as two sides of the answer to the question which was called, as I said in the beginning of our event, a social question, which meant on the one hand appearing of the population, the social masses in the scope of science, and appearing those masses in the public sphere as an active class. This process resulted in new forms of thinking about social domain, the concept of society, which is quite young, and in new forms of mass political action inspired by modern ideologies. For many thinkers of this time, for example, Polish main cooperative thinker Edward Abramowski, this social question is the same in the theory and practice. The social question for them is socialism. Socialism as a discipline, as a activity, a connected theory of thinking about society and the active practicing of socialization, this sphere of being together. Yeah, this sphere is also a subject of sociology, and because of that, those kind of thinkers like Abramowski, but not only him in Poland, for example, Marcel Mauss, with his ideas of gift, or some utopian socialists, or some anarcho-syndicalists, and some of classical sociologists, like, in my opinion, I don't know, maybe for Dieter it will be wrong, Ferdinand Tönnies also, give us an idea that it is possible to build an effective institutions, effective political and economical institution on the basis of what I called in one of my articles the pure socialization level. Yeah, the sociability, like in Zimmer's case, in this primal as the primal level, as the primal basis of organization. And Abramowski tried to build popular institutions which will be the realization of sociology, and many more of his students, like founders of SPOEM, the main cooperative union in Poland, thought that it is possible to realize sociological laws in practice, and these sociological laws are not they treated it's as a not as a kind of micro physics of being together. And I think that today we can think similar to them and consider current forms of the relation between sociology and cooperativism and political activity in general as strictly connected. And because of these investigations in this session, maybe we will reconstruct the genealogical line between us and those ideas from the 19th century to throw the light to our structure of thinking about community being together and ideas of cooperativism. Okay, the first speaker, Dieter Haselbach, will give us a lecture about this topic. He's a professor of sociology and historian of sociology, yes. And in years 2012 to 2014, director of Zentrum für Kultur-forschung, yes, Center for Cultural Research, maybe it will be better. And now, as I think, president, yes, of Ferdinand Tini's Gesellschaft, and one of the editors and main editor of Ferdinand Tini's complete works in Germany. Okay, Dieter, that's time for you.
Okay, thank you very much for the context and for the introduction. The title of my speech is a bit cumbersome in the program, which is just due to the fact that I was approached about a year ago and had this idea that was then written down. I always thought about two sociologists on cooperation. These sociologists are Franz Oppenheimer, lifespan from 1864 to 1943, and Ferdinand Tönnies, about 10 years older, 1855 to 1936. The context of these two men was the social question, were the new problems that arose with capitalism. This was, of course, also the problem that, as Bartłomiej has mentioned, led to the birth and development of sociology as a discipline in the 19th century. I start with Oppenheimer, the younger of the two. The Berliner started as a medical doctor working in a poor neighborhood in Berlin, thus familiar with the social question and poverty. In the 1890s, he gave up his profession and followed one economic idea that made his professional life as an economist and sociologist. He had an academic career as an economist and sociologist in Berlin, co-founded the German Society for Sociology, 1919. He got the first ever chair of sociology in Germany in Frankfurt, which he held until 1929. He was chief economist of the Zionist movement. 1939, he emigrated. He had to emigrate first to Japan, then to the United States. He died in Los Angeles. His papers are collected in the Zionist archives in Jerusalem, and I had the chance to look at them. His economic idea is closely related to the idea of cooperation. I need a bit of time to get into his approach. In Europe, in the 1890s, quite a few ideas were discussed to restart ideal societies without the burden of capitalism and power in settlements in no man's land, somewhere in the European colonies. Those ideas were flawed on two accounts. First, there was never no man's land, not in the colonies and not in Europe. Second, the economic programs of such settlements were not very clear, to say the least. Oppenheimer was first fascinated by those ideas. His own idea of settlement within the capitalist heartlands centered around a rural cooperative economy. He changes one parameter that has driven his predecessors to looking for no man's land elsewhere. And I quote from his autobiography. And then on an unforgettable night at the end of 1893, a lightning fast insight came to me that decided my life and aspirations, the moment of grace, so to speak. End of quote. This insight was that the price of land around a successful settlement must fall and not rise. If this were right, no need would arise to settle out in the colonies. Cooperative settlements would be economically possible in the capitalist heartlands. They would serve as nuclei, get access for ever larger pieces of land around and fundamentally change the whole economy from there. Oppenheimer was convinced that the invisible hand of markets would only function if and when rent deriving from land ownership was eliminated, and his ideas promised that a successful cooperative settlement could eliminate rent. The cooperative settlement could grow only limited by the space available on earth. They would keep collective ownership of all land. I don't want to get into economic details of this idea. Unfortunately, I need to say that it is wrong. It is wrong theoretically, and thus it proved wrong empirically. Yet the idea of free land and its effects on social organization was for decades to come a topic in economy and sociology. I remind on Werner Sombart's book from 1906, Why is there no socialism in the US, with the famous answer, if people don't like capitalist exploitation, they do not organize in a socialist movement, but move away to open land, to the frontier. Everybody has a choice between employment and the freedom of pioneer settlement. And I remind on the early years of Zionist settlement in Palestine that followed these ideas, not aware again that the Palestinian land was not free, just as the frontier in the US has never been free. For our context, it is more important to look into Oppenheimer's approach on a cooperative economy. In his book, The Settlement Cooperation, first published in 1896, unfortunately, I only know of a German version, and with many reprints, he critically discusses the fate of cooperative enterprises in a capitalist environment. In short, his point is that they cannot flourish. His discussion of the producers' cooperative yielded the law of transformation, as he called it. This is Oppenheimer's most influential contribution to the theory of cooperation. In short, this law states that a cooperative producing For the market in a capitalist environment inevitably, in answering market's demands, flexibly comes to a point where it has to A, use hired hands, or B, get rid of partners, depending on the development of the markets. Either way, the cooperative transforms into a capitalist enterprise with limited, that is, private ownership and potentially exploitation of its hands. Thus, for Oppenheimer, producers' cooperatives are not providing an alternative to capitalist market organization, are no contribution to fundamentally transform the capitalist system into a new and just economic system. Oppenheimer's solution was to create, in his settlement cooperative, a frontier within. Everybody living in the settlement could choose to either work for himself. Historically correct to Oppenheimer's world of ideas, I do not gender this expression, join an enterprise and work for others, or lease a piece of land to make his own living in agriculture by setting up an enterprise or whatever. Land would always be available for this purpose, as I stated in this lightning fast idea that Oppenheimer had. If land became scarce, its use would be intensified internally. Due to this mechanism, wages would stay high, markets would function without exploitation. Obviously, Oppenheimer was somewhere between an economic liberal and an anarchist. Oppenheimer tried for several times in his lifetime to establish a settlement cooperative along the lines he suggested. He was never successful. In Germany, Oppenheimer bought several rural estates. With the first, he went bankrupt before he came to establishing the rural cooperative. In 1933, he was politically stopped in his effort before his scheme could prove success. As the chief economist of Zionism, his plans failed for another reason. The Jewish settlers there were mostly radical socialists and did not follow Oppenheimer's idea of building a non-capitalist market society, but founded what now has come to be known as kibbutzim, with a collectivistic and not a cooperative mode of organizing production. Yet his law of transformation, unfortunate for all attempts at organizing a cooperative economy on a larger scale, proved correct wherever producers' cooperatives were established. The history of the cooperative movement is full of failed attempts and of transformations into owner-driven enterprises. It is an interesting question whether producer-consumer cooperatives are subject to the same law of transformation. I would argue that they are not. Here, production is not necessarily organized in cooperative forms and thus prone for transformation. This form of cooperation is more like buyers' cooperations with a component of insurance for the risk of the producers. For Oppenheimer, consumer cooperatives are not subject of the law of transformation, but on the same token, in his eyes, they have no potential to alter capitalism. For him, they change distribution, but not the mode of production. If consumer cooperatives start producing for their businesses, they become employers like every other employer. If one reads historic journals on the consumer cooperation movement, overwhelming evidence can be found that here Oppenheimer was right. Additionally, the consumer cooperation movement has failed to prove that it is a superior form of organizing retail. Using the German evidence, it was strong in the interwar period, but it lost strength to more modern distribution channels in the 1960s. Nowadays, large consumer cooperatives can hardly be found anymore. So that was a bit of the critical and negative part. Now I come to Ferdinand Tönnies. He was born in into a family of large-scale farming. By this, he is the only founding father of German sociology with a rural background. He spent most of his time in Schleswig-Holstein, the northern part of Germany. The first half of his life, he had to earn his living as a publicist. His academic career was obstructed by his left-leaning political opinion. Later, he became a famous public person, widely read, the first face of sociology in Germany. In his late years, He was a stout opponent of the rising Nazi movement. He died in 1936 in Kiel in Germany. On Tönnies, I must be a bit more theoretical. Tönnies developed a theory of society that on the one hand claims to deliver the categories to discuss social constellations in a way as natural sciences would discuss nature. In this, he was a positivist. His, as he called it, pure sociology is meant to be a terminology, a scholarly language of sociology. And on the other hand, he claims to apply these categories to understand the main tendency of historical development. In doing so, he attempts to transform the philosophy of history into science. Without getting too deep into these claims, I want to concentrate on one idea in his philosophy of history. Tönnies uses the two concepts of community, Gemeinschaft in German, and society, Gesellschaft. Community and Society is the title of his first and most influential book, published in German in 1887, without much success from 1912, now with success, republished 5 times until 1935 and translated in many languages, recently even into Chinese. In Germany, pre-World War II, it was the most widely read sociology text. The two ideal typical categories in a nutshell. And first I must say that Tönnies' idea was to start every sociological deliberation from the individual and look in the types of bonding individuals. Community then is a mode of connection of people based in tradition, trust, custom. Tönnies gives examples: family, village, traditional rule, to mention only a few. Community is by no means idyllic, but community is self-understanding, does not allow people to divert, or people to have, or even people to have a will to divert. Individualism is limited by the rules of the community. Society, on the other side, is based on contractual relations of individuals. No tradition, no custom hold people, but their individual will. These terms are abstractions, ideal types. They do not represent reality. In the real world, every social constellation has elements of both, of community and society, of custom binding people, and of individual will forming the constellation. Tönnies wants to use the concepts to explain these very social constellations, and that makes it sociology. Modernity, in his eyes, is characterized by an increase in social relations and a decrease of society relations and a decrease of community. But Tönnies argues that contractual relations are only possible if people trust each other. Then a society based on contracts only cannot function. It can only function if and when there remain components of community relations, because trust cannot be generated in a contract. This also means that a society completely based on contractual relations cannot exist. If the tendency of modernization is to increase contractual relations and to dry out the old modes of bonding, modernity is doomed to end in a breakdown of society. Tönnies is convinced that today's degree of modernity, this was 100 years ago, is still far away from such breakdown. But on the same token, he is convinced that it will eventually bring down our modern societies. He gave it about 400 years, which was a wild estimate. Now, cooperatives come into play. For Tönnies, yep. Oh, I thought
you are running out of time.
I'm out of time already.
Yes. 2 minutes.
Okay, that's not a problem.
Yes, but maybe 2-3 additional minutes will be okay.
Okay, cooperatives come into play. For Tönnies, they are a means to rebuild community-type institutions in a society-type environment. Tönnies addresses only consumer cooperatives. He avoids dealing with cooperative production. Most likely, he knew about Oppenheimer's law of transformation. Consumer cooperatives come into existence by a contract, thus they are a society. But the contract is characterized by common interests of the people involved. This makes them different from other contracts in business that always has an antagonistic side. In consumer cooperatives, there is no limit to size, to the opposite. The larger it is, the more efficient. Thus, members are not in competition, but share interests. Tönnies is convinced that these cooperatives, with the economic potential and with the ethical component of cooperating to get control over their own lives, bring members into ethical commitment to each other. With this, they are institutions that counteract the modern tendency of replacing community-type institutions by contractual relations society. This happens in a core field of capitalist economy on the market. Now I sum up and leave some short pieces out. Tönnies teaches that trust is needed in societies, otherwise people cannot cooperate. Without the element of community, society looks like the Hobbesian negative vision of the war of all against all. Even a Leviathan type state needs trust to come about and to function. He looks at cooperatives, namely consumer cooperatives, as places to keep alive community spirit. Other social institutions exist as sources of community. Family prevails, social welfare policy helps, public opinion has a community potential. For Oppenheimer, consumer cooperatives are an ethical power, and this ethical power makes them institutions to reform and civilize capitalism. Oppenheimer, on the other hand, teaches skepticism against any attempt to hope for an economic reform of capitalism through producers' cooperative. His settlement cooperative does not convince as the decisive institution to overcome exploitation and capitalism. Tönnies is a source for deep insight into a reform perspective toward ethically and socially embedded markets framed and regulated by politics. Oppenheimer warns against the hope in cooperatively organized production. In my view, it is advisable, but not sufficient for political change toward a social organization beyond capitalism, to make use of the ethical potential of cooperation and of cooperative organizations. And thank you very much.
Thank you once again. Okay, now we are giving a voice to Anne Kwaschik, professor of history of knowledge in University of Konstanz, and especially in her research, Anne is dealing with many problems connected with history of knowledge and social experiments and relations between knowledge and politics, and especially colonialism. She is the author of books and many books and articles about it. About genealogy of area studies and some text about social epistemology. And she's a laureate of many prestigious awards, for example, Friedrich Meinecke Prize, and a member of a number of professional associations. Okay. That's your time, Anne. I'm talking too much. Sorry.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Bartek, for this very kind introduction. Thank you to all of you for listening to me. And yeah, thank you for having me here in Warsaw, as I may say. I would like to share my screen,
There is
Bartek.
not rainy and not gloomy.
Okay.
What? Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Do you see my PowerPoint presentation? Bartek, is it working?
Yeah, but you should start your. Yes, now it's okay.
It's okay. Okay. So yeah, I want to take you back to the early 19th century to one of the first, or I'm inclined to say the first historical experience of cooperative living and labor and habitation. It is a well-known fact, and we already talked about it, that in the interwar period and in the 70s, many people tested alternative models of habitation, labor, and living. In self-descriptions and in research, these very often cooperative models have been characterized as an anti-capitalist movement away from the coldness of capitalism towards the intimacy of a self-established and self-governed social collective. However, and this is my point, these well-known alternative and often self-managed communities are deeply rooted to no small degree in early 19th century notions and practices. These early 19th century practices and notions of cooperativism present a blueprint for all future cooperative experiences, with maybe one exception, but this is the point we will discuss in later, their very vehement claim for being a scientific endeavor. So I'm very happy to speak to you because I think that here I do not have to defend the early socialists for thinking that they were doing science in establishing communities, which is very often the case when I present my current research topic. So research, as I said, research in the history of knowledge and regular historical research usually tends to overlook and underestimate the first historical experiences of cooperative living. However, these are the first experiences that has been organized on a global scale in the footsteps of the French social philosopher Charles Fourier and the Scottish manager and social reformer Robert Owen, and they were quite numerous. I tried to put them in a tentative map just to give you a first impression. And of course, this is not an exhaustive map because I'm just starting to do this research. Since the 1840s, Fourierists and ex-Fourierists established more than 40 communities all over the world. Approximately 30 communities were situated in the US. The settlements following Owen's idea started earlier in the 1820s, more than 20 communities in the US and in Canada, 9 in Great Britain. These community projects have been investigated mainly as utopias and not as practices, cooperative practices, experiments that were tested within the scope of a scientific reform program. My contribution will explore the cooperative epistemological practice of these communal living projects that were realized between the 1820s and the 1860s against and within the emerging industrial and modern societies. I will try to understand these experiences in their own right, and to do so, I will take their self-description and perception as social experiments, very serious, and as a starting point. Experiment is a common metaphor, image, when it comes to cooperative practices. However, in this context, it plays a prominent and a diagnostic role because it refers to the concrete project of the discovery of a new social science. Cooperative practices are the methods of this social experiment in its self-description of as a project for a new social epistemology. Let's start with having a look on the demeaning explanation of these movements, the one that has been coined by the so-called scientific socialists at the end of the 19th century. This view, or shall I say this verdict, is not only crucial for the history of the early socialist cooperatives in detail, but significant for social criticism of cooperative initiatives in general because of the use of the utopian label. Karl Marx's famous polemics against Proudhon, Owen, or Fourier. He attacked the early socialist views as petty bourgeois perspectives on capitalism, which was fundamentally misunderstood and could never be dismantled by small-scale cooperative initiatives. However famous and widespread it was, the model of small cooperative enterprises was soon devaluated to be an ineffectual strategy for changing society from an orthodox communist and socialist standpoint. Capitalism could not be reformed by establishing holistic, ecological, or non-alienated forms of labor. For communists of the 19th and 20th centuries alike, this leftist strategy was a betrayal of revolutionary perspectives. In his famous words, as you all know, in the Communist Manifesto of 1948, Marx had already polemicized, quote unquote, their experiments necessarily doomed to failure, rejected all revolutionary action. They were merely the experimental realization of their social utopias and served only to weaken the class struggle. By founding isolated home colonies, they were, according to Marx, merely appealing to the feelings and purses of the bourgeois. Marx rejected these experiments, which he regarded as nothing but bourgeois pipe dreams with a fanatical and superstitious belief in the miraculous effects of their social science. The cooperative ideas and practices were devoid of any systematic impulse to transform the overall system. Since they failed, they were experiments, failed attempts in that view. If they had succeeded, they would have been maybe historic evolutions. Taken in its own right, however, the early socialist set of ideas and practices looks quite different, and the experimental approach gets a very positive meaning. From a historical perspective, it represented a very serious and complex social alternative with an enormous impact and inspired very precise agendas that were getting more and more organized in the 19th century. However, as soon as in the 1750s, one of the first consumer cooperatives in France has been established by cheesemakers in the mountain regions of the Jura, followed by the famous cooperative bakery in Alsatia, Caisse du Pain, in 1828, or the communal village New Harmony, founded by Robert Owen in the US in 1825. Cooperative enterprises flourished in France in the 19th century. Previous research counted 50 producer cooperatives, 100 credit unions, 4 or 6 retail cooperatives by 1860, and so on. So the cooperative alternative was a widespread model in the 19th century, and the famous Rochdale Society, founded in 1944, might have become the prototype in Great Britain, but it's far from being the first or the only consumer cooperative at this time. So self-evident was the model in the mid-19th century that only the way of realization, bottom up or top down, has been highly controversial when the cooperative model became more politicized. The debate led to paradigmatic confrontations, not about the use of the model in general, but about the time when to start with the establishment of the system. So Owen bickered with Thompson at the Third Cooperative Congress held in 1832 in London, a couple of years after the failure of Owen's community experiment New Harmony in Indiana. Whereas Owen, who appeared less enthusiastic than usual, probably because of this failure, maintained that it was imperative to wait for government and stock exchange support and to invest into large-scale communities, his opponent, the Irish socialist William Thompson, and his supporters contended that they should rush towards establishing independent, small-scale communities based on the movement's own resources right away. It is undisputable, on the one hand, that Marx and Engels did not approve of any reformist answer to the social question. But that does imply, on the other, that their technique of othering is to be taken as what it was, one voice in a then emerging and at some point still polyphone concert of voices, debating and fighting over new social rationalities and their political and epistemological realization in a time of crisis. It is no coincidence that the birth of the cooperative paradigm as a social political alternative in the 1820s took place at a moment when socialism and social science used to be equivalents in Western Europe political semantics. Marx and Engels used their critique of the so-called utopian socialism to develop, to refine, and to promote their own ideas against these very influential movements and thinkers. And consequently, their readings were strategical and tactical, to say the least. Marx and Engels were very aware of the debts to the Anglo-French pre-socialists. They acknowledged the pioneer approach to social theory and political practice, although the early socialists were occasionally drawn into quote-unquote flights of fantasy. They explicitly stated that the utopian socialists, according to Engels, are to be reckoned amongst the most significant minds of all time. Engels took this strategy even one step further and stated that he and Marx, quote unquote, will never forget that they stand on the shoulders of Saint-Simon, Fourier, and Owen, three men who, despite their utopianism, anticipated with genius countless matters whose accuracy we now demonstrate scientifically. More concretely, the establishment of cooperative communities, regardless of their size, was part of what I call the experimental rationale of the early 19th century. Although the early socialists held many contradictory views, none of the community types they developed was conceived and lived as a private solution of global problems, as presented by Marx and Engels. In their minds, the communities functioned as social experiments of the new moral world. On the contrary, these laboratories of the future were to be erected in present times in the old world as phase one of a long-term transformation process. As Victor Considerant, the leader of the Orthodox Fourierist wing in France, put it in a manifesto to promote his own new colony, the Reunion in Texas, put it, and I quote from this advertising pamphlet, The Great West: "If the nucleus of the new society be implanted upon these soils, today a wilderness, and which tomorrow will be flooded with population, thousands of analogous organizations will rapidly arise without obstacle and as if by enchantment around the first specimens. But let us admit that nothing will be done so long as not a specimen of the new world shall not be found in the midst of the old society. It is not the dissertation of society that is proposed to you, but the solution of the great social problem on which depends the actual salvation of the world." In a systematical way, the utopian activists imagined their new social order in the mechanistic terms of the 18th century logic, refined as a modular system. Albert Brisbane, Fourier's head of communication in the US, never tired of explaining the toolbox principle of the cooperative idea according to the Fourierists, going from the construction of one house to the establishment of the new political order. And I quote from one of his exposition of the doctrine of association. So written, and this is a resume of Fourier's thoughts written by Brisbane: "The whole question of effecting a social reform may be reduced to the establishment of one association, so one colony, one settlement. Now, if we can, with the knowledge of true architectural principles, build one house rightly, conveniently and elegantly, we can, by taking it for a model and building others like it, make a perfect and beautiful city. In the same manner, if we can, with the knowledge of true social principles, organize one township rightly, we can, by organizing others like it, and by spreading and rendering them universal, establish a true social and political order." This modularized social reform distinguishes these communities from other types of cooperative initiatives in the 19th century. Early socialists like Considerant defended their project. "It is not the dissertation of society that is proposed to you, but the solution of the great social problem on which depends the actual salvation of the world." However, this resolution did not appeal to Marx and would not appeal to Orthodox socialists of any sort in the following decades, who usually maintained that salvation cannot be achieved, quote unquote, behind society's back, in private fashion within limited conditions of existence. More importantly, since Fourier understood the communities explicitly as laboratories of a new social science, he occupied the field of scientific socialism. Following Newton, Fourier was, according to himself and his followers, the first true social scientist in modern times, because he discovered the social effects of attraction for every living being and the world as a whole. Like a real physicist, he deduced his theory from observation. In this early proto-sociological view from the beginning of the 19th century, society became a form of social organization, composed of unities of data that could present the field of the new science. According to Fourier, these data sets were to be organized and classified in serial orders, and they affected every domain of the social sphere, the human being and his needs, passions, and capacities. These data sets formed the units of the new social science. This experimental approach was developed in a deterministic framework, of course, that is especially worked out in Owen's early writings, such as the New View of Society from 1813. On the one hand, environment impact on the individual, quote unquote, character is universally formed for and not by the individual. And on the other hand, the individual has the power to change the environment in any direction, quote unquote, any general character from the best to the worst, from the most ignorant to the most enlightened, may be given to any community and even to the world at large. End of quote. What was at stake here was the formation of the human character, as Owen put it, and the application of the principle to practice. So the complete title of Owen's New View of Society reads, in theory, this application of the true principles led to a new and more efficient society. To conclude on this aspect, the idea of a new social science was a shared practice of rationalization of the social characterized by four elements. First, the idea that a new organization of society be based on rational principles or laws. Second, the idea that the introduction of these principles would ultimately change equally individuals and any collective community. Third, the analogy of the new social world order and the social order of the cooperative settlements, according to the interaction of society and individual in different forms, such as proto-theories of environment or theories of social psychology. These ideas constitute the experimental approach and influence the organization of the everyday life in the communities, as well as the urban planning of the settlements at all. This rationale was deduced from Newton principles. Fourier and his disciples celebrated the true method of association as discovery of a new social law on which the cooperative communal experiments were based. Indeed, this social theory cannot be separated from the realization of the cooperative association. And this is the reason why I defend them against the label of utopianists, because it were really realized experimental communities. So they merge in the idea of a self-governed community living in a social palace according to the serial order. This palace was named the Phalanx. Here I have the first sketch by Fourier. He did it in 1829. So this palace was named the Phalanx and was the center, the community center. The community included 1,620 people, and this exact number resulted from Fourier's discovery of 810 temperaments, attracting or rejecting the different temperaments from the other human beings living in this community. The laws or principles of association brought those people together to a community aiming at the perfection of the individual and the community. Journals of this movement, such as the Phalanx, diffused and propagated the principles of this social science since the 1830s. Here you can see the first edition, the cover of the first edition of the Phalanx, Journal of the Social Science, discovered and established by Fourier, Industry, Politics, Sciences, Art and Literatures, and you can admire a picture of the Phalanx there at the first cover. Yeah. Every detail, and this is explained in the following pages of this first edition, every detail of the community living was thought and planned according to the serial laws, from the housing conditions to the organization of the working and leisure groups. Outside the thus organized community, chaos reigned, so the laboratory situation was complete and truly meant to be a social experiment testing the principles of the new society. It was exactly this claim that has been questioned by Marx and Engels in the late 19th century, whereas in earlier writings, they still praised the utopian, so-called utopian socialists for the establishment and the communist character of the communities. Both recognized that Owen's communities realized the communist way of life before the arrival of communism, and they praised the organization of an almost perfect work-life balance in the communities. Quote unquote, a happy life for everyone living in this community with less work and more leisure to educate the mind. However, this romantic presentation clouds the view on the specific goal of the early socialist project as new social epistemologies to assess the existing societies. A project of new social order had to be demonstrated as both scientifically and morally justified. For this purpose, and only for this purpose, and not to escape the social conflicts, the utopians followed their experimental rationale and constructed small-scale projects to initiate change and to show, to demonstrate that their ideal communities are plausible and desirable. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Yeah, it's a very good time, 20 minutes, nothing more. Thank you once again for your very interesting presentation. Okay, and now we have the place for Shaun Pitt, the last person in this session, the last speaker. Shaun is a PhD student at Northumbria University, and his work is dedicated to the relations between Peter Kropotkin, Anarcho-communism, and new liberalism in British context. He also he's interested in history of anarchist movement in general and women in left-wing movement, left-wing networks in the end of 19th century. And social sciences, the origins of social sciences at all. Yeah. Shaun, are you here? Yes. Hello. Okay.
Hello. Thank you for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. I think this should work. Can everyone see the title?
Yes, we can see it.
Yeah,
perfect. Thank you.
Perfect.
Hopefully, I don't know how to. There we go. Okay, I can move things now, which is good. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. I would just like to say quickly that I hope for this paper to be more thorough and detailed than what you see here. But my planned research trips of the last 7 months, including a 6-week trip to the Russian archives, have obviously been completely derailed. Which brings us on to the paper itself. In Britain during this period, the anarchist movement enjoyed significant connections to more mainstream and moderate networks. Alongside this, there were developments within British liberal networks, usually referred to as either new liberalism or social liberalism. And generally, this new liberal ideology was rooted in a more collectivist conception of society, to some extent influenced by a cooperative theory of evolution, and a commitment to using an enlarged and proactive state to reduce poverty and make British society more able to utilise its own instinct for cooperation. But also it tended to be anti-imperialist and in favour of land reform. My PhD focuses on the overlap between neoliberal and anarchist networks in this time period, but this paper hones in on how some of these intersections came through the involvement of neoliberals, and to a lesser extent anarchists and their ideas, in the emerging social sciences in Britain between 1890 and 1921. So to start off, here are some figures very important to the development of the British sociological discipline at the end of the 19th century. On the left, we have Herbert Spencer, who many people will be aware of. He was an incredibly influential sociologist in mid-19th century Britain. Ideologically, he's difficult to place and is sometimes described as a conservative anarchist, sometimes a classical liberal, but basically he was an individualist virulently opposed to the state. He is now associated with social Darwinism and coined the phrase survival of the fittest, but his theory of evolution and his politics are more progressive than many think. He also influenced Geddes, Hobhouse and Galton, who are all pictured here, as well as the Russian anarchist Pyotr Kropotkin, who I will talk about at length throughout this paper. Each individual took elements of his work and completely rejected others in their forays into the social sciences. Patrick Geddes and his disciples were instrumental in the founding of the British Sociological Society around 1903. As you can see the banner from the society at the bottom of the screen, but they were all keen to include Leonard T. Hobhouse and Francis Galton to cover different sociological perspectives that were popular at the time. Over time, however, this would contribute to a split in the society that would leave Geddes specialising in town planning and civics, Hobhouse claiming to represent official sociology, and Galton forming a school of eugenics. Geddes himself believed in a generalist approach, combining various social sciences and also biology into one broad sociology. And his political views were vaguely radical liberal, but his ideas were infused with anarchism from his close association with anarchists. Hobhouse, on the other hand, was one of the most articulate advocates of the new liberalism and wrote many books elaborating this philosophy. Galton, who is not important to this paper, was a conservative eugenicist. Geddes and Hobhouse competed for control of the Sociological Society and its academic journal over the first decades of its existence, and also for the first British chair in sociology at the London School of Economics, which would eventually go to Hobhouse in 1907. Both Geddes and Hobhouse were agreed on the importance of cooperation rather than competition to the continued biological and sociological development of the human race. This, combined with Galton's social Darwinism, imbued the Sociological Society with a consistent focus on evolutionary theory at its inception. And this brings me to what I like to call the academic anarchists. These individuals all spent time in Britain and had significant academic connections here and on the continent. All except Eli, pictured on the right, were friends of Geddes, and it should be noted that Eli's son Paul was a very close friend to the Scottish sociologist Patrick Geddes. I didn't mention before, he's from Scotland, he's from Edinburgh. Similarly to Geddes, they combined a broad variety of social sciences and biology into their own academic contributions that were frequently combined to advocate for an anarchist future. Above all, however, it was Kropotkin that influenced the British social sciences. One of Kropotkin's most famous works, Mutual Aid, A Factor in Evolution, was published in 1902 in Britain and collected together his essays in prominent British publications from the 1890s. In it, he argued that cooperation was a bigger factor than competition in evolutionary biology. He claimed this to be a part of Darwin's central thesis in an attack against those social Darwinists such as Galton, who he argued were misrepresenting Darwin, not Kropotkin. His academic anarchist allies, pictured here, agreed or expanded upon this thesis in their work, but also made their own individual forays into sociology and the other social sciences such as social psychology, anthropology, and human geography. Kropotkin's other famous work at the time was Fields, Factories and Workshops, published in 1899 in Britain, itself also being a collection of articles published in prominent British publications over the course of the 1880s and 1890s. In this, he made an economic and social argument for a decentralised and cooperatively run economy refocused on agriculture and away from the now dominant urban industrialism. Both of these works made Kropotkin a very prominent thinker in Britain, especially because in his economic assessments, he was talking about Britain as an example. But they also made him a prominent thinker in land reform, agriculture, biology, and sociology. While his allies displayed here never ascended to these heights in Britain, they retained deep academic connections in the country and all had good relationships with Patrick Geddes. A unifying theme in both of Kropotkin's main works was a passionate optimism for the potentiality of human beings if they organise their societies along more cooperative lines. Kropotkin had been advocating for a greater balance between the life and economies of rural and urban areas for over a decade when he published Fields, Factories and Workshops in 1899. He found himself on the same side as many radical liberals in these debates, especially within the Garden City movement. Its founder in Britain, Ebenezer Howard, spoke at length about how he was attracted to Kropotkin's decentralized approach to achieving harmony between rural and urban activity, and sought to achieve this through detailed planning of the environment and community projects to encourage social cohesion. This was best captured in his Garden City idea, for which he set up the Garden City Association in 1899. The organisation brought together many old liberals, new liberals, socialists, and businessmen concerned about urban living conditions. In 1903, they founded the world's first garden city, Letchworth, in southern England, a poster for which is pictured here on this slide. In this garden city, communal living was encouraged, and the city was intended to run along cooperative lines. It is probably clear at this point, Howard's ideas are also frequently linked to the Fourierist settlements mentioned by Anne, and my paper nicely kind of interweaves between both the two previous papers. Patrick Geddes and disciples of his, such as Thomas Marr and Victor Branford, were also involved in the Garden City movement around this time. In addition to Geddes and Howard, who both acknowledged the influence of anarchism on them, there were also anarchists such as Sidney Potter, living in Letchworth and participating in the experiment. During this time, Geddes wrote a great deal of work establishing the basis of the academic discipline of town planning that culminated in his Cities of Evolution in 1915. All of these developments also fed into the new liberal housing and land reforms led by the liberal governments of H.H. Asquith and David Lloyd George. Asquith was Prime Minister of Britain between 1908 and 1916, and David Lloyd George between 1916 and 1922. The Land Inquiry Committee of 1912 to 1914 was led by Benjamin Seaborn Rowntree, who was a member of the prominent British Quaker family of liberal philanthropists, the Rowntrees. I'm not sure how famous they are abroad, but in Britain they're a very famous family, who was also a friend of Kropotkin's. So that's Benjamin Seaborn Rowntree was also a friend of Kropotkin's and had published a cheap version of Kropotkin's Fields, Factories and Workshops in 1902 to aid its distribution. The committee, the Governmental Land Inquiry Committee, took advice from Kropotkin and presented plans for reform to Britain. Rowntree was also a key advisor to the government on the 1919 Housing and Town Planning Act, as well as a close friend of David Lloyd George's. I have only very recently been able to start reading Rowntree's letters to Kropotkin, which number over 50 and range over a decade, but they give a clear indication that Rowntree read all of Kropotkin's works very keenly, including his overtly anarchistic work, and greatly respected the Russian. Rowntree and the New Liberal reformers also consulted with Garden City advocates and prominent members at length in the design of these policies. Howard's Garden City Association had been committed to independence from the state and to be led by investment from and into the community from the very beginning. But ultimately, the association became quickly dominated by businessmen, and Howard's attempted blend of quasi-anarchistic town planning and liberal market principles conflicted, leading to those principles that were not inherently conducive to business, especially the social aspects, receiving less priority or being completely discarded. It was also eventually absorbed into the British state as a housing policy, another thing that Howard opposed strongly. This clearly corroborates similar things to what Dieter was saying about Franz Oppenheimer's experiments. And Oppenheimer himself was also, I think, involved in the German Garden City movement, but I could be incorrect about that. In Britain, however, there continued to be many individuals involved in this Garden City network who were sympathetic to or directly influenced by Kropotkin's ideas. Their legacy can be felt within the academic field of town planning, which continued to produce overtly anarchistic figures such as Colin Ward, who was a very prominent figure in the 1970s within the remnants of the Garden City Association, now renamed Town and Country Planning Association. It is clear to see that the field of town planning has both liberal and anarchist origins, with the two intertwining in the past to advocate for cooperative living, but continuing to contribute more recently. One of the key things connecting anarchists and liberals was their shared belief in a cooperative theory of evolution. Anarchists and new liberals, rather. The classical liberals had a variety. A lot of them were quite in favour of competition. But the new liberals and anarchists shared a belief in a cooperative theory of evolution. Outlined in Kropotkin's articles in the 1890s and eventually in his 1902 book, Mutual Aid, which the front cover is pictured here on the right. This cooperative theory was the belief that species that cooperated with each other, and even to some extent with other species, were more likely to survive and therefore evolve. Within this, the Russian portrayed species of animals, including humans, banding together to protect each other from their surrounding environment, which often threatened their life through harsh weather conditions or scarce resources. Kropotkin and other advocates acknowledged competition as a force in evolutionary biology, but argued that cooperation was a similarly or more important force within that process. Many new liberals agreed with this, and scholars such as Michael Frieden have argued that the very ideological basis of new liberalism, especially its commitment to a more collectivized society, was driven by this belief in a cooperative theory of evolution. Evolutionary biology was very much entwined with British sociology at this time, as I mentioned previously, and the prominent liberal sociologists, Geddes and Hobhouse, were elaborating cooperative theories of evolution and clashing with the competitive theories of individuals such as Francis Galton and Karl Pearson, who would split off to found eugenics, again, something I mentioned before. Hobhouse was a very influential voice in the development of the new liberal political philosophy at the beginning of the 20th century, arguing for the importance of a social policy that encouraged humans to be more cooperative and more able to cooperate, in part by reducing their poverty and terrible living conditions. He reviewed Kropotkin's work positively, and the greatest distinction between their theories was that Hobhouse believed that only animals of a higher intelligence cooperated, while Kropotkin argued that all species cooperated, even to some extent on a cellular level. Other new liberals, such as the MP and journalist George P. Gooch, recognised the importance of Kropotkin's theory to British discourse, however, and saw that Hobhouse as merely building upon it as a foundation. Geddes, on the other hand, frequently acknowledged Kropotkin and Reclus' work throughout his career. He also corresponded with Kropotkin at length before the publication of his 1888 book, The Evolution of Sex, to discuss the sociological implications of evolution and their shared distaste for the stern individualism of evolutionary theory based purely around competition. Hobhouse remained a prominent and influential figure in academic sociology in Britain and was the chair of sociology at London School of Economics between 1907 and 1929, while Geddes specialised more in town planning. Geddes did continue, however, to have many disciples in British sociology and in American sociology, and perceived himself as a sociologist, as he stressed that he saw town planning as a practical application of sociology, focused on humanity's interaction with its natural environment. In both their sociologies, however, we see the importance of a cooperative theory of evolution and the desire to improve the individual by improving their environment, whether that be social or physical. Both Geddes and Hobhouse were also anti-imperialists who advocated for a more peaceful foreign policy and a greater cooperation of nations to reduce armed conflict. The vast majority of new liberals were also anti-imperialists, and as a movement it was largely united by its opposition to the 1899 Boer War, an infamously unpopular war amongst liberals, socialists and anarchists in Britain. In the years following the Boer War, there had been a growing commitment amongst liberals to a belief in peace biology. In short, this was a belief that peace and all of the benefits of peace to a society were good for biological evolution, in part because they encouraged cooperation. This was in strong opposition, again, to the more conservative arguments in favour of competition, and something that led some social Darwinists to advocate for war as a positive force in the evolution of human society. New liberal individuals like Hobhouse opposed this conservative philosophy and argued that tribal societies of the past were not dominated by warfare. This was also supported by the anthropological findings of individuals such as the anarchist Reclus brothers, who I pictured previously. And within this network of individuals advocating for peace as a positive force in biology and society, there were a variety of positions, ranging from advocating for outright pacifism to more democratic control over foreign policy. And many within these networks also discussed the importance of cooperation between nations, or to more radical figures, the inherent competitiveness of states as institutions. Many of the advocates of these approaches were instrumental to the foundation of a field of international relations, which had its first professorship in Britain in 1919. Norman Angell, the English New Liberal journalist and peace activist, wrote a pamphlet in 1909, which was later published as a book in 1910, entitled The Great Illusion, which is often considered a foundational text for international relations. Within it, Angell quotes from Kropotkin. Oh, a minute. Oh, I just saw my message, sorry. Within it, Angell quotes from Kropotkin's Mutual Aid to argue that human beings historically have been more inclined towards peace. A few years later in Britain, a Council for the Study of International Relations was founded in 1915. Slides should change, there we go. And it included Angell, who spoke at this inaugural dinner and spoke on behalf of the organisation to funding bodies. And when Kropotkin returned to Russia in 1917 to try and influence the Bolshevik Revolution in what he believed to be the correct direction, he corresponded with this council to discuss the foundation of a school of international relations in Russia. But Kropotkin's advocacy for cooperation as a biologically and sociologically important factor in the evolution of human society, supported by his anarchist friend and liberal friends, clearly influenced debates about Britain's foreign policy and role in the world, and debates that naturally flowed into the foundation of a field of international relations in Britain. So to conclude, at the birth of many of these prominent British social science disciplines, we can see the influence of anarchists, especially Kropotkin, who were allied with more prominent liberals in their advocacy for a better cooperation between the city and the field, but also at the very basis of human development had and continued to centre on our cooperation with each other. Thank you for listening to this paper.
Thank you very much, Shaun. It was very interesting for me and very rich presentation. Now we have about 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes for discussion, and I'm open to space for questions from the other participants. Okay, we've got the first asking from Leo Maric. Please, Leo.
I think I was not the first one.
No?
I think Anne was the first one.
Okay, sorry, yeah.
No problem.
Mm-hmm. Anne?
Mine was just a short remark. I found it very interesting that we came back to the relationship between biology and sociology. So the nascent sociology disciplinary field in the 19th century was very obvious in your presentation, Shaun, and this brings us back to something that Michael said this morning. I think that it is really a very important topic, and not completely searched in the history of the humanities, that the social sciences really developed against the backdrop and in the framework of what they had been given by the natural sciences. And I think this might be the reason that in the later movements we discussed, this biological natural science backdrop is less obvious. I don't know, this is maybe a question to Dieter, what he would say about the interwar period. Is there any interaction between biological theoretical frameworks and the ideas of cooperation or attraction or living together.
Well, maybe I just give a brief answer. I think one could make Shaun's paper on German sociology likewise on these connections, and in particular not in the interwar period, but in before World War I. There were lots of discussions between biology or on especially eugenics, which was not by then tainted by the Nazi use of this. Lots of discussions, very productive discussions, and of course Tönnies, whom I mentioned, was very deep in this discussion. And everybody, of course, knew their Darwin. They knew. They all had read Spencer, who is much deeper. Shaun has mentioned this, is much deeper than only the phrase "survival of the fittest." So, I think it was a truly international discussion at that time on biology and sociology. And only when it became, and this was a radicalization in the interwar period, biology and eugenics became a right-wing topic. Before that, it was a very productive discussion.
Mm-hmm. Anne, could you ask something more?
No, I just wanted to ask, but Dieter already answered that if there is something like an "and," right? Because that this is a very international discussion, yes, but did it end at the end of the First World War, or how shall we do this genealogical picture, what you ask us to do?
Then maybe I should give a voice to Shaun.
I mean, I agree with Dieter. I'm very much aware that it's a kind of an international thing. I focus on Britain more because of the scope of a PhD means that I can't really do an international. And also I talk about a few different, this is only 1/5 of my PhD. I think that, as Dieter has kind of implied, I think it becomes radicalized after World War I and combines with a lot of right-wing theories about the descent of society and the collapse of civilizations, and then becomes this much more radical application. There's a lot of like right-wing stuff in the before World War I, but also there's a lot of, like I mentioned Karl Pearson very briefly. Karl Pearson's a socialist, eugenicist. He very much advocates for a better genetics and better eugenics for society so that we can all live better in a kind of more socialist utopia. And there's definitely other socialist eugenicists. But I think in the interwar period, those socialists kind of like mostly ebb away, but there are certainly always strands. Now the Soviet Union has some interesting eugenic stuff going on that time period as well. It's certainly not my speciality, but it's something I did at postgraduate, so I'm sort of vaguely aware of it.
Thank you. Okay, I think that now we can go to Leo Maric.
Okay, do you hear me?
Yes, it's good.
So I would firstly just like to say that all of the presentations were excellent, and I'm looking forward to read them in the edited volume in the future. I hope it will be published. But my question goes to Shaun. It is not directly about the historical period you are talking about, but I think it's relevant to the topic. So are there some remnants of this cooperativist ideas of the new liberals in that period in contemporary Liberal Democratic Party? Something like Blue Labor? Is there something like that in the Liberal Democrats today?
You know, I thought this might come up. I have an extra research topic I'm kind of working on in addition to my PhD, which is very much low key. But there was a spate of like liberal radicalism in the 1960s and 1970s in this country, of liberal activists involved in the anti-apartheid movement and things like this. And they were very strongly, and there was a member of the Liberal Party at the time who was very pro-cooperative running of factories and had posters about mutualism and things like this, and talked about Kropotkin. And it was all very radical and all rooted in the student movement. But since then, since the 60s and the 70s, it's kind of completely fizzled out. The Liberal Democrat Party is a merger of the Liberal Party, which was very rooted in kind of a lot of more old liberal stuff, and the Social Democrat Party, who are more conservative. And so the Liberal Democrat Party is very much, I don't know, it's neither really. New liberalism, I would say, what happened to new liberalism in the 1920s and 1930s was that it was largely absorbed into the Labour Party. The Labour Party was a weird alliance of socialists, radical and moderate, and radical liberals who had left the Liberal Party. And I would say that a continuing problem or a continuing thing that happens in the British Labour Party is that there is a constant tussle between radical liberals and socialists, both moderate and radical, and at different times, different parts of that are powerful. So I would say in some ways the current leadership of the Labour Party are kind of somewhere in the new liberal, moderate liberal way. But also Jeremy Corbyn, the previous leader, he quoted extensively from John Hobson, who's a very prominent new liberal thinker. It was a massive news story in this country because he wrote a preface to John Hobson's book about imperialism, which is very influential. And John Hobson's quite anti-Semitic in the book. And there were connections made between this, and an accusation was made that Corbyn was kind of blind to it, or anti-Semite himself by sharing this work, which was kind of quite a shallow accusation because a lot of different kind of left of centre figures, like Nick Clegg of the Liberal Democrat Party, and some more left-wing members of the Conservative Party had also mentioned Hobson. So they continue to echo, especially Hobson. But they're all very minority figures, and I would say within the right of the Labour Party is probably where they are now.
Thank you, Shaun. Okay. Maybe we have another questions for our participants. I don't know. Let me hear nothing. Okay, maybe this is a time for me because I have two questions. This time not to Shaun, but to Dieter and to Anne. In Dieter's paper, for me, this most interesting thing in the case of teenies, it was the question: what was the reaction for his ideas and for his scientific theories in German proletarian movement? What was because in Polish case the ideas quite similar to teenies was connected with the neutral, so-called neutral socialist cooperative movement against the radical proletarian cooperativists, sometimes or many often, not sometimes, connected to a communist party at the beginning of the 20th century. What was the German context and German reaction of German proletarian parties to the ideas of teenies, and maybe more to the investigations of German sociologists at the beginning of the 20th century? And one question to Anne about her paper, because you said that for Marx this the ideas of utopian socialists was very problematic in general. And I think that maybe the good context to talk about this is a problem which was described in articles of Bruno Jossa or Min-Sun Lee, the researchers dealing with the problems of cooperatives in Marxism. For example, one of the last articles of Min-Sun Lee in Class and Capital, I don't know where it is, it was here, sorry, where Min-Sun Lee said that for Marx, the main problem was that cooperative movement is not building a class consciousness. And because of that, for him, the workers' cooperatives was failed in this first period of their existence. And what do you think? Is it possible to think about this, maybe not utopian, this realizations of Owen's and Fourier's communes in class terms? Because I think that the problem of class structure is present in, for example, Fourier's works, but not explicit there sometimes, and maybe this point will be a good connection for thinking about these relations about the first period of socialism in their work and Marxism. What do you think about it? Okay.
I think Anna should start to
maybe
keep it in chronological order.
Yeah. Okay, chronological. Yeah. My answer is very, very short. Yeah, exactly. You cannot, I think historically, you cannot think in class terms when you want to describe the realization of the communities, because there were no workers involved. And as Marx and Engels stated, working class was not so developed in the early 19th century in France, especially. So this is also, so the reading of the later cooperative initiatives you mentioned is a very good point against the so-called utopian communities as well. But this is also the point, the reason why they were in some writings also very indulgent with the utopian socialists, because they could not know better, because the working class was not so developed at that time. So it was not possible to involve the working class. But historically, no, there were no workers, very few workers involved in this initiative. It was rather, yeah, say, bourgeois endeavor, except the Owen New Lanark experiment, of course. This was a real working class structure, of course, but this was a very managerial and patronage system. It wasn't not like the future communities, right? So they were not self-governed. They were ruled by Owen, so it was different.
Okay, okay. Thank you very much.
Okay, now you asked the question. I could easily improvise a second lecture even longer than the first one. To start with an anecdote, when Tönnies was in the early 1880s, his family allowed him to go to London, where he coincidentally found interesting unknown manuscripts of Hobbes in the British Library. He was explicitly forbidden to meet Karl Marx, who was working there, by his family, because the family knew he was a communist. Later, when Tönnies became a prominent figure, he was very closely connected to the social democracy and to a reformist understanding of proletarian policy. But to stay independent as a person, he joined the Social Democratic Party and left the church in the early 1930s as a official move against the Nazis, a symbolic move against the Nazis. And if you look into the public writing and into the sociological writing by Tönnies, you would find that he even interprets Marx and Engels in their later writings, and he always refers to the 1959 preface to the Critique of the Political Economy, as a reformist, as someone who would not follow the Communist Manifesto anymore, but would set on solution of the social question by reforming and building up a social welfare state. It's rather interesting how he sees Marx. By the way, Tönnies was one of the first recipients of Karl Marx Capital. His Community and Society book is full of Marx in the analysis of capitalism and so on. So it's a rather differentiated picture. And as a public person, as a political person, Tönnies was clearly always on the side of working class, supporting strike movements and so on, by stating, okay, but we have to overcome this by reforms. And then a last thing, since we talk about cooperatives, he was publishing endlessly in small cooperative newspapers and journals and so on, and always supporting this consumers cooperatives movements for reasons that I have stated, which was also, again, the reformist, the moderate social democrat, so to speak.
Okay, Shaun.
I just wanted to, I tried to add to something that Anna just said about, I guess it's more like adding in more like kind of a later update, is that what I think is quite interesting, it made me think the question about class in these communities. In the Garden City movement, one of the main criticisms is that it was largely middle class. People would come, it was intended to be a thing where poor people would come and live a better life outside of the urban centres, especially London. But it just ended up being middle class families all moving out there, and it became this weird sort of middle class enterprise where everyone there was of the same sort of social class.
Anna, would you answer?
Yeah, I just wanted to add something. What surprises me always, and this is that this garden movement, Shaun, you mentioned and showed it, that they were sometimes referring to Fourier, but however, what they did was exactly the opposite, right? For Fourier, everyone has to live in this social palace. It's community building, right? So there are no individual houses or even gardens around them. That was what they really didn't want. Was the enemy, the intellectual and theoretical enemy, these individual houses, right? The community, the new community of the new world constitutes itself in this social palace, right? So this is I think fascinating, this change in the reception.
I think it's in some ways it's kind of an odd hybrid of that, and maybe like some of these more these British land reform things about having land to farm and land to live in, and they kind of combine to just having a garden. And it's quite a big thing. It spreads across the world. It's like colonial as well as across all of Europe, and there's a big one in Germany.
And it's interesting, last sentence, because the realization, there are very few realizations of this social palace. But if you look at them, they look rather like Foucault's panopticon. Right, this is really a very social, disciplined society that has been erected like that.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, I think that if anyone has something more, this is a good time because we should stop. Cesare.
Just a really quick question to Anne. I've been thinking about what you just said about Flannisters. Do you think that the idea of organizing the space of Flanister was connected with the cloisters or monasteries? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, I think that it is also in the name, right? Phalanstère is monastère, is between phalanx and cloister, right? And it is there is a book from a colleague in the US, it was a comparison between living in these monasteries and these religious communities and the early socialist community. There are a lot of similarities, and of course there is one difference, and that is the early socialist people chose their constitution, right? So it was a democratic start and not the, yeah.
Yeah, but ad vocem, you must know, Mikołaj told that I am fascinated in early Christian ethics.
Okay.
I read a lot about monastic rules from the early period, and Basilian rule from the Basil the Great have some democratic elements inside it. For example, I forget the English word for that. Let's say the chief of the monastery was chosen by the monks, not by the bishop or so on. But okay, that's...
Okay, then I have another difference, at least in regard to the Fourierist communities. You know that Fourier was one of the first who predicated free love, right? So they were really like the communes in the 70s. So this might be a difference.
Okay. But thank you very much for that.
But of course, the idea is very close to that. It's fascinating. And also the social palace, the drawings I showed you, it's a very conservative idea. It's a castle, it's like Versailles, it's not very modern, right? This is what Benjamin criticized in his book on Paris.
Thank you.
Okay, now we should stop. Oh, sorry, one question more from Jakub Kowalski.
Sorry, can you hear me?
Yeah, it's good.
One short question for Shaun, because I was taking part in another parallel session, and I joined here like in the end of what he was talking about, new liberalism, Hobhouse, and influence of liberalism on Labour Party. And I want to ask if, like, probably everybody knows here the connection between late liberalism and early labor movement in Britain. And I only want to clarify something, like the approach of Hobhouse new liberalism towards like foreign policy approach, like pacifism, mutualism, was inherited by early labor movement. Like, is there any direct link, or there were some other influences in that? Because like Lansbury, Henderson were pretty similar, in my opinion, in this approach. And I just want to maybe you to clarify that.
Yeah, I think that I was going to mention Lansbury when you said, I think that Hobhouse was an anti-imperialist, but at the same time, World War I skewed a lot of people's opinions, and a lot of these anti-imperialists became more open to like Britain being a great power in a moral sense in the world, and sort of started to believe that Britain could that Britain should use its imperial might to be like a better example for the world. So a lot of these anti-imperialists became a bit entangled in it, and I think the Labour Party is a similar thing, where there's the left anti-imperialist faction that remain that way, and also more moderate factions that stayed a bit imperialist. And I think the great connector really is Ramsay MacDonald. Ramsay MacDonald's very much a Fabian in the 1890s. He's in the New Liberal movement in the 1900s, in the Rainbow Circle and a few other organisations. And eventually he's the Labour Prime Minister, I think the first Labour Prime Minister. And then, so in his opinion, he's kind of, I would say he has quite similar opinions to Hobhouse, and is very much a moderate socialist / radical liberal. I don't know if that quite answers your question, but I think, yes, I think they inherited it a lot. Yeah, I think Lansbury's kind of an outlier. I think Lansbury as a kind of pacifist in the Labour Party is kind of an outlier, and that the party tends to be more moderate, vaguely anti-imperialist, but sometimes a bit too close to imperialism for comfort.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you once again. We have a 45 minutes break for lunch, and maybe today some physical exercises. I've got some problems with my spine, and after that we'll meet with guerrilla media collective and their project Disco to see how the communal patterns are constructed in real environment. And after that, I would like to invite you to key lecture by Marcelo Vieta about Argentinian cooperatives and about his researches in this topic. Thank you for now, and see you in about 45 minutes.